Hello again, and here we are with another video on one of Plato's dialogues. Today we will be speaking about Alcibiades number 1. First, a caveat. Some of my previous summaries of Plato's dialogues were a bit long. They're dense dialogues, and if you just explain what's going on and give some impressions, that usually takes you to at least 40 minutes. So I'm going to try something else this time. I'm going to break the commentary and summary into approximately 10-minute videos. So we'll probably have 2 or 3 for the Alcibiades. So without further ado, let's get moving. So let's start with a little introduction to this dialogue. So it's called Alcibiades. So a good place to start is explaining who Alcibiades was. So Alcibiades was an incredibly talented and famous or infamous 5th century BC figure in classical Athens. He came from a really powerful aristocratic family on his father's side. His father died when he was young. Through his mother's side, he was related to Pericles and another really important aristocratic family in Athens, the Alcmeonidae. And in fact, he was the ward of Pericles, who was, the factotum of Athens during its golden age. He was also extremely handsome, extremely intelligent, very good at speaking in public. And, he was like the ideal of Kalos Kagathos, like the Greek ideal of manhood. His many abilities and virtues, nevertheless, turned out, well, they made him a famous figure, but they turned out to his disadvantage. Classical Athenian politics, and you could say generally classical Greek politics, is built against two powerful figures, and Alcibiades was just too talented, too smart, too powerful, too dangerous. And he has a series of vicissitudes in the period of the Peloponnesian Wars, which we will not go into, but suffice it to say, for classical Athenians, he became the epitome of the corrupt, decadent, talented, but ultimately turned into evil kind of person. He served the Athenians, but after the Sicilian expedition was launched, he was going to be executed for some presumed fake charges on crimes. He switched sides to the enemy, the Spartans. After serving the Spartans, he switched sides against to the Persians. Then he switched again to the Athenians later on. And, he ended being murdered by Spartan spies. So he was a really gifted, intelligent person with lots of talent, associated with the aristocratic and slightly anti-democratic circles of classical Athens, in which both Plato and Socrates got themselves involved. He ended up infamously in exile and dead. And a good case can be made for Socrates' association with Alcibiades and a few others as one of the main arguments that were used against him later when he was tried for, among other things, corrupting the youth of Athens. And probably the jury who judged Socrates had in mind his association with anti-democratic aristocrats who had done harm to Athens, and most notoriously the immoral and overtly powerful Alcibiades. So that's the character Alcibiades. When we begin the play, we have to imagine him as this sort of gilded youth representative, really talented, handsome and young, and going to serve in office. And we know in retrospect, as the writers and readers of this dialogue knew in retrospect, how this would end. That is to say that Alcibiades' incredible talents and abilities would not be harnessed towards the better of ends, particularly not the philosophical ends. Okay, so having presented the figure of Alcibiades, who will have, we have to also mention this, a very close relationship as far as can be historically ascertained with the historical Socrates. This is shown in Plato's other dialogues, particularly the Symposium, but it's also present in other sources. So like Socrates acted as a sort of intellectual mentor of Alcibiades, just as he did for other Athenian aristocrats like Plato or Critias. And there's this close relationship. This dialogue presents a fictionalized version of this first encounter, of this first establishment of the relationship between Alcibiades and Socrates. Okay, so the dialogue is traditionally attributed to Plato. Is it a real Platonic dialogue? Well, we don't know. Traditionally, it was considered one of Plato's dialogues, and it was very popular from a pedagogical point of view as a starting dialogue, an introductory dialogue for those who wanted to learn about Plato, because as we shall see, the main idea of the dialogue and the main plot device is, getting a wise and seasoned teacher, Socrates, to introduce a talented but naive and ignorant young man to the virtues of self knowledge and of self knowledge as the basis for all other sorts of knowledge. Searching for one's true self. It's the foundation of the philosophical project in, if not in the Greek world, at least in 5th century Athens and in the Socratic and Platonic schools. The idea is, as explained in the Apology, that the unexamined life is not worth living. Which means if you want to be a virtuous, successful person, you need to start with a process of introspection in which you try to arrive at a foundation for truths about your own self, which you can then expand to truths about others and about the world at large. So we were saying this dialogue, very pedagogical. It can be easily extrapolated to the situation of any teacher trying to introduce to a pupil the value of philosophy, what philosophy is good for. Later scholarship has been critical about it being Platonic. This is basically because of the German criticism that says that some choices of words and the style of the dialogue feel different from that of other dialogues of Plato. So there are some minor references to events that might have taken place a bit later. But anyway, well, whatever the basis for believing that this dialogue was written by Plato or not, it's certainly a dialogue of the Platonic school. If it wasn't written by Plato, it was written not long after Plato, in the 4th century, in the early part of the 4th century BC, maybe by disciples of Plato in the academy. The tone, the message is very, very Platonic. The previous dialogues that I've summarized are generally those that, according to Vlastos, probably recreate to some degree the historical Socrates, his peculiar ways of behavior and thought. This is a little bit different from that. So like in the typical early Socratic dialogue, again, if you accept Vlastos' thesis, which is controversial, but if you accept the thesis that some early Platonic dialogues really reflect Socrates' thought and his doing, you generally get the situation in which Socrates has some dialogue with some Athenians on a topic, generally an abstract virtue that needs to be explored, like bravery or chastity or truth, whatever. And Socrates doesn't really push forward any view of his own, but he interrogates the others and gets them to fall into self-contradictions. And those dialogues usually end in an aporia, a sort of contradiction. And they don't end on like a positive note. We just saw that some popular views on some important topics do not have apparently simple or self-evident answers and therefore require more reflection. This one is different. So this is different in that you could say there is an overarching idea. It's not so much the expression of an abstract idea like justice, although justice gets given a lot of importance in this dialogue. It's more like self-knowledge is the way of becoming cultivated, a whole, a successful kind of person. So it's not exactly an abstract concept being developed, unless the abstract concept is know thyself, the northeast theauton of the Delphic oracle. Also, Socrates mostly interrogates Alcibiades, but especially towards the end of the dialogue, he's clearly introducing some concepts which some historians or philosophers would argue, are maybe not original to Socrates and more to Plato, like the idea of the soul as an entity existing separate from the body and as the soul being the most important aspect of a human. Anyway, as we say, the dialogue is not necessarily Platonic, by which we mean written by Plato, but it's definitely Platonic in the sense of being a product of his school. Perhaps not one of the early dialogues, if you accept that categorization. Okay, so to conclude this introduction, we will just say that the main theme of the dialogue is a very famous Greek maxim, gnothy se auton. It's the foundation of this dialogue. In the Temple of Delphi, the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, there were, since at least the 5th century, probably earlier on, some maxims inscribed on the building. And these maxims were taken by the Greeks, as you know, really solid common sense and, almost divine mandates on ethical or social behavior. There were a couple of these. One of them is medenagan, nothing in excess. Another one of them was gnothy se auton, know yourself, know thyself. Now, it is plausible to consider that both of these maxims probably appeared earlier on. They might be associated with the 7 sages of Greece, which flourished in the Archaic period. We can imagine that know yourself, as in its original conception and inscription in the Delphic temple, would have had a more traditionalist, conservative read of the sort of be aware of your limitations, be aware of your social status and class, what would have been good ethical maxims for the Archaic period. Gnothy se auton becomes a key maxim here, but Socrates and or Plato give it a twist, which goes into what we could say introspective exploration of oneself and of truth, which links it to the philosophical project that, as we say, even though it might have antecedents, starts with Socrates and with Plato and continues in successive philosophical developments. Okay, we will leave it here for today. Next day, we will start with the dialogue and the first arguments going back and forth.